Right side to the 10 to the 5, touchdown! 6, going to the hoop, puts it up, puts it in! A fantastic play.
Once again, welcome into Magnolia Fields, episode 5. Brad, I've been corrected. This is the Hotty Toddy edition. We had done episode 1, and I referred to it as episode 1, but it was episode 1 of the Hotty Toddy edition only. And quite honestly, we've got Tanner and Cody doing a great job doing high school and the Mississippi State edition. And so this is episode 5 of Magnolia Fields already. And, you know, we're giddy about the preseason, the rankings, everything's coming out. Brad, Logan, Frank Dodds with you. I want to set the stage a little bit, Brad. I want to set the stage, and I want you to react. Ole Miss coaches poll, top 6 ranking. It marks the highest a Lane Kiffin team has been ranked in the preseason since 2012. Mm-hmm. What happened in 2012? Lane Kiffin didn't make it through that season.
Right.
Lane Kiffin's actually never coached a team, if you want more bad news, that started preseason top 15 and ended in the top 15. However, last year was the second time he's taken a team preseason top 25 and finished in the top 25. So there's some momentum there. There's some culture. What are you seeing, Brad, around the program? You're there. You get to ask them questions. You get to meet with the players. What are you seeing from them coming into the 2024 season?
A very confident team, and it's not so much a quiet confidence as it is a team that's embracing its expectations. We heard from Keith Carter, the athletic director, who we appreciate being part of our program, the last program we had, and he also embraced those expectations. You talk about Lane Kiffin's coaching prowess when he was a head coach. I will tell you this, Frank. He's a different coach than he was in 2012 from what I've seen, and he's a different coach from what I saw last year after the passing of his father. He seemed to be a more confident coach, but I think it's more of a quiet confidence. And so I'm excited to see what he does as head coach this year. I will say this. Right, back in 2012, that did not end as well.
But he was very young. I agree with you. He is a different coach. He's a different person. He's a different man.
Yeah, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, because you look at what he's done as an assistant coach, Frank. He's won a couple national championships at Alabama.
Yep.
He's learned a lot. He took Florida Atlantic into new heights, a couple of Conference USA championships. And, oh, by the way, the games that Ole Miss is supposed to win, they win. You look at a couple of years ago, Frank, the only 2 games that Ole Miss has lost when it wasn't a favorite was to Arkansas on the road in 2022 and at home against Mississippi State. The remainder of the games, while Lane Kiffin has been a head coach, they've won as a favorite. Also, their home record has been incredible. So I think this year is setting up to be a very special one. We'll get into some of the pros and cons of this season. But to answer your question, I see a somewhat invigorated Lane Kiffin, one in which I think he's ready for this stretch run, and one in which I think he's ready to cement his head coaching legacy on this 24 season.
Yeah, and like you said, the players are embracing this. You talked about that a little bit on the previous episode, but talk a little bit about the reaction you're getting from the players.
Yeah, I had a chance to visit exclusively with Jackson Dart, the quarterback that's on a lot of Heisman Trophy preseason panels, and is one that, Frank, he wasn't recognized by the Southeastern Conference as being one of the top quarterbacks in the conference, and I asked him about that.
That should light the fire underneath
Well,
him.
I mean, I asked him, is that bulletin board material? Is that something you wear on his shoulder? And he kind of gave a political answer, but I have no doubt that he's going to wear that on his shoulder when he plays these teams that we'll talk about in the Southeastern Conference. But players like Caden Prieskorn. Caden Prieskorn is a father. He's a husband. His draft stock was very high after that 23 season. He, along with Trey Harris, Jordan Watkins, J.J. Pegues, Jackson Dart, the list goes on. They all came back. They all came back for one reason, and they're not shying away from that.
As a group.
They came back as a group. Jordan Watkins told me personally that they came back after talking to win a national championship. Keith Carter talked in the last program. They came back, and he's excited. The fans are excited about a chance to win a national championship. They're not shying away from that. They're facing these expectations head on. And so this is not a season like 2009 in which Ole Miss opened up on the cover of Sports Illustrated with Jevin Sneed, and then a couple of weeks go to South Carolina on a Thursday night and lay an egg. This is not that type of team. That team did not embrace those expectations. They fell. They did not do what they needed to do. They would eventually lose to Mississippi State, and they would go lose in the Cotton Bowl. So this is a different team, and this is a different Lane Kiffin, and this is why I think that Ole Miss will be so successful this year in football, 24 season.
You want some good news? This is our schedule edition. We're going to break down the schedule. Not going to break it down as much as we will during the season.
Right.
So during the season, as we have a group of 4 games in front of us, we'll break down those 4 games. We're going to give a broad overview of the schedule. That's kind of what's on our rundown for the day. It's just a broad overview to talk about some other teams that they're going to face along the way, to talk about some other games that will have an impact, because what we're all looking for is the college football playoffs. And so some of these other games will have an impact, even if they don't include the Rebels in that game. Who's going to win Tennessee, Alabama? Things like that could have an impact. What's Tennessee's record going to be? Ole Miss doesn't get to play them. What's Missouri's record going to be? Who's the dark horses? Because I think Tennessee's probably a dark horse. But we're going to get to all that schedule stuff. But you want some good news? Ole Miss plays 9 power conference teams this season. Mm-hmm. Wake Forest is out of conference.
Right.
At Wake Forest. 5 of those 9 did not go to a bowl game last year.
That's
so
interesting.
They're not.
Yeah.
They don't have this culture, and that's why I was talking about culture. Is they don't necessarily have this winning culture. Wake Forest had been to 7 straight, but they didn't go last year. Just the wheels fell off, and so they've got probably a leg up on some of these other ones. But yeah, the culture isn't in there. So 5 of the 9 did not go to a bowl game. Of the 4 that went to a bowl game last year, if we still believe anything about bowl games last year, which sometimes you do. I believe Nussmeier is a pretty good quarterback at LSU after watching him in the bowl game last year against Wisconsin. Of course, he's replacing a Heisman Trophy winner at LSU, but I still think he's pretty good. Some bowl games you can look into him. The bowl game Florida State played, you can't take anything away from that bowl game. So I still kind of like the bowl games as a barometer, a building point for you going. Of the 4 that went to a bowl game, 3 of them come to Oxford. The only one that does not come to Oxford, to me, is the key to the whole season for Ole Miss, and that's Saturday night in Baton Rouge, game number 7.
It's LSU, and that's the game I think everybody is kind of looking to. I mean, we talked about Georgia, but Georgia's not a game you have to win, Frank. I mean,
if you've already beaten LSU, you do not, and Oklahoma. If you've taken care of your business at that point, you got to play better than 52-17.
Yeah.
You can't come out of there thinking we can't win this thing, which you talked about a little bit on episode number 1, the coaches, the players, to be able to compete, kind of like the feeling they got last year. You've got to have a better showing than 52-17. But you're right. You don't have to win that game.
I think chalk would be Ole Miss as an underdog to Georgia at home. I think right now some of the betting services have that game as anywhere from a 5 to a 7 point underdog or Georgia favorite. And the other game will be LSU. Now, here's the interesting part of LSU. I think right now Ole Miss would be anywhere from a 1 to a 3 point underdog in Death Valley. But LSU opens the season against USC. I think it's in Las Vegas.
Yes.
So
on a Sunday.
On a Sunday. And we're all going to be tuned into that because we love college football. But mainly, Ole Miss fans are going to be tuned into that because that's a big game.
That's a big
LSU
game.
drops that one. Then all of a sudden, nobody's talking about this game either. LSU has to go to South Carolina.
Yeah.
That's not going to be easy if they've already fallen to USC. They're not rolling out the red carpet for Brian Kelly right now. Nussmeier is not a quarterback that I've seen that can just throw it all over the field. If it weren't for Jaden Daniels, Ole Miss wins that game handily last year. He was incredible. With Malik Neighbors, even with Neighbors in that receiving core, LSU was pedestrian in a lot of positions with the exception of Jaden Daniels, who was incredible at quarterback.
Can they play defense? I think every Rebel TV is going to be tuned in to the Sunday afternoon game, opening weekend, Labor Day weekend, to see if they can play defense. They got fabulous, probably one of the best defensive players, but I don't know if they know if they're using him correctly.
Right.
And they've got a new defensive coaching staff.
Yeah.
And Brian Kelly is a culture guy. We're talking about Lane Kiffin's culture. Brian Kelly is a culture guy. Listen to this. 3rd year at Central Michigan, 9 wins. Only the second time since 1980 that Central Michigan had 9 wins. 3rd year at Cincinnati, Orange Bowl. 3rd year at Notre Dame, BCS National Championship game. He has this history of.
He has a pedigree.
And particularly in year 3. Year 3 at each one of these schools, he achieved lofty things that had not been achieved at those schools recently.
It will be interesting to me. You know, we could talk all day about the history of Saturday night in Death Valley.
I know.
And you talk about Dan Bourne, who's the PA announcer, who I've been able to meet, and it's really cool to meet him when he says, as the sun sets over the western sky, it's Saturday night in Death Valley. And it gives me chills just thinking about it. Now, I'll be able to see that in person and hear that, and that's just a life moment for all of you. If you're watching, you get a chance to go to LSU. If you've never been, you got to go. But let's talk about football for a moment. And, you know, we could go all day about Ole Miss's record at night in Death Valley, and it's not great. So many games in Death Valley that Ole Miss has played in, they've come out on the losing end. But here's the kicker, Frank. When Jevin Snead was a quarterback back in 2008, Ole Miss just wiped the field with LSU. Back in 1997, Ole Miss had a better team than LSU, and they won the game. So I go back to roster management. We've seen what Brian Kelly has done. I don't know how well he's done from a roster standpoint versus what Ole Miss has done, specifically in the portal. And we could talk about Ole Miss's defense all day, and it is laced with portal talent. And they've been able to go and get some of the best players in the country thanks to the Grove Collective and the prowess of the recruiting of Pete Golding, the defensive coordinator, and head coach Lane Kiffin. You talk about players like Walter Nolan, Princely Umanilan, the transfer out of Florida, Chris Poop-Hall, the leading tackler from Arkansas, Chris Graves, the transfer. I could go on and on. Trey Amos, the transfer out of Alabama. Brandon Turnage, who is actually a walk-on, but signed with Alabama out of high school, transferred to Tennessee, and wanted to come back home and play for Ole Miss, played at Lafayette County in nearby Oxford. So he is a player. And he's one of many that I think it goes back to the fact of who's got the best roster. And I'm quoting Nick Saban when I say, people say I'm a great coach, but I've won all the games I've won because we've had really good football players. And I go back to, if Ole Miss has a good or a better roster than LSU, I get the theatrics. I get the earthquake game in 1988 against Auburn when Eddie Fuller caught the pass and the earthquake went off in Tiger Stadium. I understand all the comebacks that they've had against Alabama and Florida. But if Ole Miss has a better roster than LSU, I'm taking Ole Miss down in Baton Rouge.
And that's just one of the themes. As we're going to start breaking it down, like I said, this is episode 5, and we're going to be able to spend some time on the schedule during this episode. The other big overarching theme to me about this particular season, 2024, and particularly as it applies to Ole Miss, the college football playoff. I can paint you a scenario where there's perhaps an 8-0 SEC team.
In conference.
In conference.
Yeah.
8-0, yeah. 12-0.
Yeah.
But in conference, 8-0. And 5, count them, 5, 7-1 in conference.
So my question to you real quick before we go to the next layer here, how many SEC teams, Frank, make the college football playoff in your scenario?
I don't know. I don't think they'll take 6 of the 12 spots.
I don't either.
I think it's 4.
Because the Big Ten is a huge player in the college football playoff. And I think the Big Ten and the SEC will get the same amount of teams in. I truly believe that.
It's that to me is going to be the thing that we're all watching. We're all anticipating, yes, we'll watch LSU. We'll know whether they can play defense pretty quickly in the season. But the thing that we're all watching after that is other games and who's going to finish the highest in the SEC. And I'm not saying Ole Miss has to be in the championship game. I'm not even sure that's an advantage anymore. I'm not sure I would want to go to a championship game as long as I was close enough to be in the top 12.
The interesting part about this, Frank, is there is a path for Ole Miss to win the national championship and never step foot in Atlanta for the SEC championship game. Now, it would have to step foot in Atlanta to win a national championship because that's where the championship game is being held. But the funny part about that is Ole Miss could go undefeated. Not undefeated, but they would have lost the game somewhere along the way to not make it.
Does it say they lose to Georgia?
Right.
Yeah. At home.
Then they wouldn't make it. But an interesting question. We asked Keith in the previous episode, what does it look like if Ole Miss doesn't make the SEC championship game? How will it fall in the pecking order? And he essentially said he wasn't really sure.
I don't think they've said it.
I don't think we know.
I didn't want to be that pointed to our guest, who was kind enough to come in for the earlier episode of the Hottie Toddy edition, but I don't think they know.
I think it's going to have to do with the college football playoff rankings.
I think you made the most valid point. Is it's easier if you start off high and stay there all season long. If you stay,
and they're going to start off high. If you're Ole Miss and you're a fan and you're worried about that, don't worry about it. You're going to start off. And Frank, we'll look at the schedule in a moment. I think the way it opens, and I asked Jackson Dart this last Wednesday for Ole Miss Media Day. I asked him about the schedule, and he even admitted that the schedule sets up good for Ole Miss, which means it's conducive to win. And I really like how it opens to give this team a chance for the transfers that have come in both offense and defensively to gel together in the opening games of the season.
Advantage or disadvantage? When Ole Miss does go to Baton Rouge on that Saturday night, they will have played 6 straight games. This will be their 7th game. They have the latest bye of anyone in the SEC. It's after the LSU game. LSU will be coming off of a bye.
Yeah. Normally, I think that would be problematic. But for this Ole Miss team, Frank, it is so deep on offense and defense in regards to a depth chart. They've got a full third-team offensive line. They've got a full third-team wide receiving core. They're so deep, I don't think it matters.
With that thought, we're going to take a quick break and step outside we got to pay the bills, step outside of the Richard Schwartz and Associates studio, and we'll be back with episode 5, Magnolia Fields, the Hottie Toddy edition, right after this.
Welcome to the Richard Schwartz and Associates Magnolia Field Studios. One call, that's all.
Welcome back into the Richard Schwartz and Associates studio. Brad Logan, Frank Dodds with you, episode 5 of Magnolia Fields. We're just barely getting warmed up. We've been talking about the Ole Miss schedule. Let's talk about the first 4 games. 3 out of the 4 are at home. At Wake Forest is the only one on the road. A Power 5 opponent, but not one you expect much of a game out of.
I'm excited about the first couple of games. And one thing that I'm excited about seeing is, as we talked about before the break, all of the transfers, specifically on defense, but really all of them on offense and defense, being able to have these first 4 games to be able to kind of gel together. And with Furman, Middle Tennessee, we talked about Wake Forest on the road. Then you come home against Georgia Southern before you get ready for the SEC season against Kentucky. You also got a road game in there. And I think that's good, too, to kind of work out some cobwebs on the road. You know, Dave Clawson, who was the OC at Tennessee, did a great job there, the head coach at Wake Forest. They lost a lot. I don't know that they're going to prove to be a big power. I think the last thing I saw was a 21-point Ole Miss favorite on the road. So, once again, an opportunity to yet again get wins, and I think that's what you want to do early.
And an opportunity to see a decent quarterback. Wake Forest has brought in Hank Bachmeier, who's thrown for over 8,600 yards in a couple of years at Boise State, a year at La Tech. So he can throw the ball around, and that'll give an opportunity to see, like you said, go on the road, gel as a team, and see some good competition.
I think so. And you know, this is kind of akin to last year when Ole Miss went on the road and faced a Tulane team in which offensively Ole Miss just did not play well. And Tulane provided to be a formidable foe. Now, Ole Miss would eventually stretch the lead in the second half and win that game. But, Frank, I look at this schedule, and I kind of reference it towards the NCAA basketball tournament. And what I mean by that is you've got 12 games on the schedule, depending on what happens with the SEC championship game and any type of playoff games and bowl games. And this is a survive and advance situation because you look at a Wake Forest, and if anyone says that Ole Miss, you better be careful with Wake Forest, you better be careful with South Carolina, Kentucky, Arkansas. Here's the thing, Frank. If you don't win those games, season doesn't really matter. So you have to go in with the mindset is there are no off weeks. You survive in advance. You go week to week. And I think that's the mindset of this team. Lane Kiffin even said the last media opportunity we were able to have with him, It's 100% a pro mindset. And what he means by that is it's week to week. Each individual opponent provides different challenges that you face. And with that pro mindset, the ultimate goal is to win a national championship. And that's exactly what we've seen from this team in the offseason.
Yeah, no doubt. And the next 3 games, for real, now they start really counting. You know, you can't lose any of those 4.
Right.
That would count against you for sure. But the next 3 weeks, Kentucky, at South Carolina, at LSU. And
we've seen Ole Miss face a Kentucky team a couple of years ago in a sold-out. They striped out the vault. It was a huge crowd, 11 a.m. And, you know, that 11 a.m. slot has been kind of formulated by the Big Ten off of Fox by being the number 1 game out of Fox's noon college football show. You know, back in the day, the 11 a.m. game was the Jefferson Pilot game on Raycom, and it was the game that everyone kind of laughed at. Now it's one of the preeminent games in college football. So that 11 a.m. game is going to be one in which it's going to be 11 a.m. again this year with Kentucky coming in. And, you know, we saw Mark Stoops kind of get some play during the offseason, really 2 years ago, about some different job openings. And he's been in Kentucky this entire time. I don't know how good Kentucky's going to be this year. Frank, they lost a lot from last year, but we'll see how good they are. But it'll be a nice test for Ole Miss. But, yeah, that on the road at South Carolina, I've been pretty adamant about that. It's going to be anywhere from a 5 o'clock to an 8 o'clock Eastern tip.
And that's a hard place to play at night.
You know, even when Lou Holtz, before Lou Holtz got there, they were 0-11. And even when they were 0-11, they played Clemson. And they ended up losing, but they sold out the stadium. They sold out season tickets even when they didn't win a game. So South Carolina and Williams-Brice Stadium is going to be a wild environment. Ole Miss is going to be the team now that's going to have a bullseye on its back in South Carolina. And, you know, Shane Beamer is a coach that he's got a lot to prove this year, Frank. Last year, 5-7. That's not going to get it in Columbia. You know, that's a couple of seasons.
I think he's on the hot seat.
I do too. I think he along with Billy Napier, are 2 coaches, and then Sam Pittman at Arkansas. Those are 3 teams that Ole Miss is facing, and coaches kind of have their backs against the wall.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this 3-game stretch, and we've already talked about LSU. I think if Ole Miss gets out of that, if they come out of that undefeated, you know, they've done their job. And
we're going to break down these games. Let's talk to the schedules. We will be back in the studio before some of these games are played. We will have only missed the Furman game. So we'll be able to break these down a little bit further, talk a little bit about Kentucky's new OC, talk about their new quarterback, Brock Vandagriff from Georgia. And, you know, we'll talk more specifically about South Carolina and some of the things. They won't have a Spencer Rattler anymore. And so we'll get back into that. The at LSU game we've already talked about. It's going to be a big one. We will get to highlight that in a later episode of Magnolia Fields. Then an off week. That helps, finally. And then you got Oklahoma, at Arkansas, Georgia. Could that be mayhem? Could that be madness?
It could be, but you know, the 2 biggest games and we could argue LSU, but I think the 2 biggest games are Oklahoma and Georgia. I mean, I've said all along, I think Ole Miss beats Georgia at home. I think Ole Miss, roster-wise, is as good as Georgia. I think the problematic games for Ole Miss are going to be Oklahoma at home, simply because I really like their roster. I like what they're bringing to the SEC, and I think that's going to be a tough game. And it's sandwiched, and I think, you know, depending on what Ole Miss does at LSU, they're coming home to face Oklahoma. So I've said all along, I think the Rebels beat Georgia, finish 11-1, and probably drop one to either LSU or Oklahoma. So, but out of that stretch, I think Ole Miss, if they can somehow go 2-1 between Oklahoma, Georgia, and Arkansas, they should be okay. But look, anytime Ole Miss goes to Arkansas, Frank, it is not
that's
particularly gone well. And
I know.
That's going to be
I've been there. I've done that.
11 a.m. game
with Tommy Tuberville.
It's going to be an 11 a.m. game. Who knows where Sam Pittman and the Hogs will be at that point during the season? Who knows if Sam Pittman will even be the coach at that point? Will they have elevated Bobby Petrino, who's the offensive coordinator, who served as a head coach a couple of years ago? Stay off those motorcycles. And we'll see where Arkansas is at that point in the season.
Yeah, and then they wrap up the season. Just stay strong. I'm with you. At Florida, Mississippi State, in the Egg Bowl, I'm not sure Billy Napier will be there. I just think his seat is that hot. And Florida's schedule is that hard. Miami, Texas A&M, at Mississippi State, at Tennessee, Georgia, at Texas, LSU before Ole Miss gets there. I don't think there's going to be much of a Florida team left.
In that Florida game, once again, is at 11 o'clock. And we were told that that Ole Miss and its administration, since it decided that, the SEC, ESPN wanted to move the Egg Bowl to Saturday. Ole Miss did not want the game on a Thursday, so they pretty much came together and they moved it to Friday. So historically, Friday's always been Arkansas, LSU, and then the SEC tried to create an Arkansas-Missouri or LSU-Missouri rivalry. It just hasn't worked well. So Ole Miss and Mississippi State now will get a nice 2:30 slot on Friday on ABC. So who knows where Mississippi State will be at that point. But back to that Florida game, Ole Miss has went to Gainesville and played well. Historically, you think back to that 2008 game in which Houston Nutt took Jevin Sneed, and that team prior it had lost to Vanderbilt the week before, goes in with a record of 2-3, and Shea Hodge goes off that game. Jevin Sneed, Greg Hardy is seen on the cover of Sports Illustrated, so it was a big win. Ole Miss has shown that it can go there. Florida ended up winning the national championship that year, so Ole Miss has proven it can go to Florida and win. But I say this, Ole Miss, if it's where it needs to be, Ole Miss is going to have that 11 a.m. slot, and I was told that Ole Miss had an opportunity to pick any road game they wanted for a time, and they picked that Florida game, and they wanted it 11 o'clock. So
get them home a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
There's some.
And, Florida's not an easy place to play, and that's a place to where at night it can get kind of rowdy. So they wanted that game at 11 o'clock, and, of course, you come home and play yet another, day game, I guess you could say. The only chance Ole Miss has a chance to playing a night SEC game, Frank?
Baton Rouge.
Well, at home.
At home. No.
Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia.
And it may not be a night game. It's in that window of 2:30 to 8 o'clock. So they may not able to play but 1-2 night games, and that would be Georgia Southern and Furman. The Middle Tennessee game kicks off at 3:15. So interesting there.
We're going to take another quick break. We'll be back on Magnolia Fields, episode number 5, right after this.
If you've been hurt in a car wreck, you know who to call. Call me. Remember, one call, that's all.
Welcome back to the Magnolia Field Studios, brought to you by Richard Schwartz and Associates. One call, that's all.
Welcome back into the Richard Schwartz and Associates studio here for Magnolia Fields, episode number 5, as we wrap this one up. One of the things we want to talk about all year long, and we've already teased it once, is other games in the footprint that could impact the final CFP playoff standings and could impact the Rebels. I named it Franco's Fabulous 15. We're going to only cover the first 2 because they will be played before we get back in here for our next episode, and that is Texas A&M at Notre Dame on Saturday, August 31st. That's a big one. It's
a big one because, Mike Elko, the new coach at Texas A&M, we're going to be able to see what he can do on a big stage. And, A&M is
proven. What do they have?
Yeah.
Because of their schedule, they're one of those that could go 7-1. Maybe 6-2 in the SEC. They do finish with Texas, but that's such a rivalry game. I don't know who wins that. It's at A&M, I think.
It is, and I like Texas A&M's chances against the Longhorns this year at home. And what Mike Elko can do is I really like his roster, but I don't know if it's ready for the big time yet. He hasn't had a chance to get in and get his kind of players, but A&M has proven they've got the money, and they've got the money to back their coach, and we'll see what happens this year against Notre Dame.
No doubt. LSU and USC. Neutral site game, Vegas on the opening weekend, Sunday, September 1st.
Huge game from Ole Miss's standpoint because we've talked about earlier, LSU has to go to South Carolina after this game. If they lose to USC, which very easily they could do, I'm not sold on Nussmeier quarterback. We'll see what they have at running back and at wide receiver. They lost a lot. We'll see where the Tigers are, but huge game for Ole Miss in the footprint.
And these are games that we will talk about a little bit closer to them. And I'll tell you, LSU thinks they've got some wide receivers that are young, unproven, but maybe better than the ones they lost. Because you mentioned them losing wide receivers. You're dead on. But they think they got some young studs coming up. But we'll talk about all that on future episodes of Magnolia Fields. We sure do appreciate Max South Sports Network for letting us in here, Richard Schwartz and Associates for sponsoring this fabulous studio. For Brad Logan, I'm Frank Dodds. Until next time on Magnolia Fields.